Isabella Munro never imagined that dignity could feel heavier than fear. Yet as she stood across the street from the towering glass building, one hand pressed protectively against her stomach, that was exactly what weighed her down. Not terror, not shame, but the quiet, aching determination to be treated like a human being. The building rose into the sky like a monument to power. Polished steel. Endless windows. A place where decisions were made that shaped cities, crushed competitors, and created fortunes overnight. Blackwell Industries. The name alone carried authority. Money. Distance. Isabella took a slow breath as nausea twisted through her again, sharp and sudden. She waited for it to pass, counting silently the way the clinic nurse had taught her. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. She couldn't afford to faint here. Not now. Not before she did the one thing that mattered. 2 months. That's all it had been. 2 months since her life had quietly split into a before and an after. Before, she was just Isabella Munro, freelance event coordinator, part-time nonprofit assistant, granddaughter to the strongest woman she'd ever known. A woman trying to stay afloat in New York City on talent, grit, and late nights. After, she was pregnant. Alone. And standing outside the headquarters of one of the most powerful men in the city. Christopher. The memory of him still felt unreal, like a dream her mind replayed when the world became too heavy. He had walked into the charity gala without an entourage, without arrogance, yet somehow commanded the entire room. Tall. Calm. A presence that didn't demand attention but pulled it in anyway. She remembered the way he'd smiled at her when she corrected a mistake on the seating chart she hadn't even known she'd made. Remembered how he laughed, actually laughed, when she joked about the absurd price of champagne no one even finished. They hadn't exchanged last names. They hadn't talked about money. They hadn't talked about power. They talked about loss. About dreams. About the quiet loneliness that hides behind success. That night had felt safe. Equal. Human. And then the next morning he was gone. No note. No number. No explanation. Just the echo of something beautiful that ended too soon. Isabella crossed the street when the light changed, her heart pounding harder with every step. Each movement felt symbolic, like she was crossing into another world. One where she didn't belong, where she would be judged before she ever spoke. The revolving doors swallowed her whole, spinning her into a lobby that looked nothing like her life. Marble floors reflected light like water. Modern art hung on walls that likely cost more than her grandmother's entire apartment. A massive chandelier glittered overhead, cold and untouchable. And behind an imposing reception desk sat the gatekeeper. The woman looked up slowly as if already annoyed by the interruption. Blonde hair sculpted perfectly into place. Makeup flawless. A designer suit so sharp it seemed to cut the air around her. Her eyes scanned Isabella from head to toe in a single dismissive glance. Yes, the woman said. The word was polite. The tone was not. I need to see Christopher Blackwell, Isabella replied, forcing her voice steady. It's urgent. The woman raised a sculpted eyebrow. Do you have an appointment? No, Isabella admitted. But it's personal. If you could just tell him that Isabella Munro is here. The woman smiled, but it never reached her eyes. Mr. Blackwell does not see anyone without an appointment, she said crisply. Company policy. I understand, Isabella said quickly. But this isn't business. It's important. Please. The woman leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. We get dozens of women every week, she said coolly, who claim they have something important to discuss with Mr. Blackwell. Heat rushed to Isabella's face. I'm not just. Of course you aren't, the woman interrupted, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Let me guess. You met him at an event. Had a magical night. And now you need to see him urgently. Isabella's throat tightened. We met 2 months ago. And I need to speak to him today. The woman leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice into something sharper. Crueler. Whatever you think happened between you and Mr. Blackwell, she said, it wasn't special. And you weren't special. The words landed like physical blows. Now, she continued, I suggest you leave before I call security. For a moment, Isabella couldn't breathe. Then she straightened. Then I'll wait outside, she said quietly. He has to leave eventually. The woman shrugged, already turning back to her computer. Suit yourself. Outside, the sun beat down harder than Isabella expected. She found a spot near the entrance where she could see everyone coming and going. The hours stretched painfully, one blending into the next. People passed her without looking. Some glanced briefly, curiosity flickering before disappearing. Others stared openly, their expressions dismissive, judgmental. Inside, through the glass, she could occasionally see the secretary watching her with thinly veiled amusement. By noon, Isabella's stomach growled. Her throat was dry. Her legs ached. She stayed. By mid-afternoon, the nausea returned stronger, stealing her breath. She gripped a lamppost, grounding herself, thinking of the small flicker she'd seen on the ultrasound screen just yesterday. A heartbeat. Their heartbeat. She remembered her grandmother's voice that morning. Hold your head high, sweetheart. Truth doesn't bow to power. At 4 o'clock, her vision began to blur. She should leave. Sit down. Get water. But what if he came out while she was gone? At 5, her knees trembled. The world felt distant, unreal. And then the doors opened. A group of men in suits stepped out, laughing softly, purposeful. And there, at the center, was him. Christopher Blackwell. The sight of him stole the last of her strength. He looked exactly the same. Confident. Calm. Untouchable. She tried to step forward. Tried to speak his name. The sidewalk tilted violently. The last thing Isabella saw was his face, eyes widening in shock as he broke into a run. She never felt herself hit the ground. Christopher caught her just in time. Her body was frighteningly light in his arms. Too light. Her skin was cold, her breathing shallow. Call an ambulance, he shouted. But even as the words left his mouth, instinct took over. Get the car, he snapped to his driver. Now. As they sped away, Christopher held Isabella against his chest, memories crashing into him all at once. He had searched for her. Hired investigators. Returned to the gala venue again and again. And now she had collapsed outside his building. At his penthouse, a doctor arrived within minutes. She's severely dehydrated, the doctor said. Malnourished. Christopher's jaw tightened. When Isabella finally opened her eyes, tears spilled instantly. I found you, she whispered. You're safe, he said softly. Her hand moved to her stomach. I'm pregnant, she said. 10 weeks. The baby is yours. The world shifted. The silence that followed her words felt heavier than anything Isabella had endured that day. I'm pregnant. 10 weeks. The baby is yours. Christopher Blackwell didn't speak right away. For a man who negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking, who stood unshaken before hostile boards and ruthless competitors, the sentence had knocked the breath clean out of him. His mind grasped for order, for logic, for something solid to stand on, but all it found was the echo of that night, replaying with merciless clarity. Her laugh. Her warmth. The way she'd looked at him like he wasn't a title or a fortune, but just a man. You're sure? He finally asked, hating how sharp the words sounded the moment they left his mouth. Isabella nodded slowly, tears streaking down her cheeks. I had my first appointment yesterday. I saw the heartbeat. Her voice cracked on the last word, but she didn't look away. Christopher ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the bedroom like a caged animal. The penthouse, his sanctuary, his fortress, suddenly felt too small. Too loud. Too exposed. Dr. Mitchell cleared his throat gently. Based on her symptoms and timeline, pregnancy is very likely. I can arrange a paternity test as early as tomorrow. Christopher stopped pacing. I want that, he said immediately. The words landed hard. Isabella flinched just barely, but he saw it. Of course he did. He saw the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her jaw set like she'd been expecting this all along. I understand, she said quietly. I would want proof too. That answer hurt more than anger would have. Dr. Mitchell finished setting up the four, his movements calm and practiced. She needs rest, fluids, and nutrition. She's exhausted. When the doctor left, the room fell into an uneasy stillness. Christopher stood near the window, looking out over the city he controlled so effortlessly, yet for once he felt completely powerless. I'm not trying to trap you, Isabella said after a moment. I don't want your money. I thought you deserved to know. He turned to face her, then really looking. She looked smaller than he remembered. Thinner. The confidence she'd carried that night dulled by fatigue and humiliation. But her eyes, those were the same. Honest. Steady. Brave. I've been lied to before, he admitted, his voice low. Someone told me the same thing once. It wasn't true. Isabella listened without interrupting as he told her about the woman who had manipulated him, who had used the illusion of pregnancy to steal and deceive. He expected defensiveness. Anger. Instead he saw understanding. I'm not her, Isabella said simply. But I don't expect trust without proof. Something inside him shifted. Before he could respond, the door opened. Aunt Margaret's here, the assistant announced hesitantly. Margaret Blackwell swept into the room like a storm, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, commanding. She stopped short when she saw Isabella in the bed. "What is this?" Margaret demanded. Christopher squared his shoulders. "This is Isabella Monroe." "And why?" Margaret said coldly. "Is she in your bed?" "She collapsed outside the building," he replied. "She's pregnant." Margaret's eyes narrowed instantly. "Another one?" The room tensed. "I'm right here," Isabella said softly. "And I'm not another one." Margaret studied her like a business problem, something to be solved, minimized, eliminated. "We'll see what the test says," Margaret said. "Until then." "Until then," Christopher interrupted firmly, "she stays here. And she will be treated with respect." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't argue. The next 2 days were some of the longest of Isabella's life. Despite the luxury of the penthouse, she felt like an intruder, every movement measured, every breath cautious. She caught whispers from staff. Felt eyes lingering on her clothes, her posture, her presence. Emily, Christopher's teenage sister, was the only one who treated her without suspicion. She asked questions, about the baby, about Isabella's grandmother, about what it was like growing up without parents. "Do you think the baby will like music?" Emily asked one evening. "I hope so," Isabella smiled. "My grandmother used to sing to me when I couldn't sleep." Christopher watched these moments quietly, torn between disbelief and a growing, dangerous hope. Margaret, on the other hand, wasted no time. Private investigators were hired. Background checks run. Every corner of Isabella's life examined. And every report came back the same. No criminal record. No debts. No hidden connections. No lies. Just a woman who worked hard, lived modestly, and had raised herself with integrity. Still, doubt lingered. On the third morning, Dr. Mitchell called. Christopher put the phone on speaker, his hands clenched into fists. "The results are conclusive," the doctor said. "Christopher, you are the father. 99.9% certainty." The room went silent. Isabella covered her mouth, tears spilling freely, not of triumph but relief. Christopher sank into a chair, the weight of reality crashing over him all at once. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, looking at her. "I should have believed you." She shook her head gently. "You needed proof." "I understand." Margaret said nothing. But something in her expression changed. That afternoon, Isabella finally went home, to pack. Christopher insisted on driving her himself. Queens felt like another world compared to his penthouse. Smaller streets. Older buildings. Life worn but real. Her grandmother, Rose, opened the door with cautious eyes, until she saw Isabella. "Baby," Rose breathed, pulling her into a hug. "You scared me." Christopher stood awkwardly behind her, suddenly unsure of his place. "And you must be the man," Rose said, turning to him. "About time you showed up." There was no accusation in her voice. Just honesty. Christopher swallowed. "I should have been sooner." Rose studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You've got a lot to make right." As they packed, Isabella felt something she hadn't in weeks. Hope. But back at Blackwell Industries, another storm was brewing. Vanessa Sterling, the secretary, stood frozen as news traveled through the building. The woman she had humiliated, the one she'd dismissed, was carrying the CEO's child. And Christopher Blackwell was not known for forgiving disrespect. The news traveled through Blackwell Industries faster than any press release ever could. Whispers followed footsteps. Conversations stopped when Christopher walked past. Phones buzzed behind polished desks as assistants and executives exchanged stunned messages they pretended not to send. The woman who collapsed outside. The one Vanessa turned away. She's carrying the CEO's child. Vanessa Sterling sat frozen at her desk, staring at her computer screen without seeing it. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she refreshed her inbox again and again, as if hoping this was all a misunderstanding that would disappear if she ignored it long enough. It didn't. Christopher Blackwell hadn't returned to the office since the announcement. That alone was ominous. When Christopher went quiet, it usually meant something seismic was coming. Vanessa swallowed hard. For years she had been untouchable. The gatekeeper. The woman who decided who mattered and who didn't. She turned away investors worth millions. Shut down social climbers, desperate models, opportunists with fake smiles. She'd never been wrong before. She couldn't have known, Vanessa told herself. How was I supposed to know? But deep down she remembered Isabella's eyes. Not desperate. Not manipulative. Just determined. Isabella felt the weight of attention immediately. Returning to the penthouse after packing a few essentials from her grandmother's apartment felt surreal. She hadn't asked for this life, hadn't chased it, and yet here she was, moving through spaces where people suddenly stood straighter, spoke softer, watched her carefully. Some smiles were genuine, others were calculated. She missed the simplicity of her old life already. That evening, Margaret requested a private conversation. They sat across from each other in the penthouse library, shelves of leather-bound books lining the walls like silent judges. Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I owe you an apology," Margaret said at last. Isabella blinked, surprised. "I misjudged you," Margaret continued. "I assumed motives that were not there." Isabella nodded once. "I understand why." Margaret studied her closely. "Most people in your position would already be calling lawyers, negotiating, making demands. I didn't come here for that," Isabella replied. "I came for the truth." Something in Margaret's stern expression softened. "You have more restraint than most people twice your age," she said, "and more integrity than many people in this family." That admission carried weight. The following morning, Christopher returned to the office. The atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped into the lobby. Conversations died. People straightened. Vanessa felt her pulse pounding as she watched him approach her desk. "Mr. Blackwell," she said quickly, forcing a smile. "Good morning." "Vanessa," he replied calmly. The calm was worse than anger. "I'd like you to bring every appointment request you've denied in the last 3 months to my office," he said. Immediately, her throat went dry. Is there a problem?" "Yes," he said simply. "There is." Minutes later, Vanessa stood in his office, clutching a tablet to her chest like a shield. Christopher didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He asked questions. Why she had turned Isabella away. Why she assumed motives without verification. Why she felt entitled to decide who was worthy of respect. Vanessa tried to explain. Tried to justify. Tried to deflect. "She didn't look. I didn't think. We get so many." Christopher raised a hand. "You made a judgment," he said quietly, "based on appearance and assumption. And because of that, the mother of my child collapsed on the sidewalk." Vanessa's face drained of color. "I trusted you to protect this company," he continued. "Not to humiliate people." "I didn't know," she whispered. "You didn't bother to know," he replied. The silence that followed was absolute. "I'm suspending you effective immediately," Christopher said. "HR will contact you." Vanessa's career, built on control and cruelty, collapsed in a single sentence. The public reveal came days later. Not through tabloids. Not through scandal. Through action. Christopher stood beside Isabella at a company-wide event, his hand resting protectively on her back as he introduced her, not as a liability, not as a secret, but as family. "This company was built on respect," he said into the microphone, "and we failed to show it. That ends now." Isabella felt the room watching her, some with admiration, some with discomfort. She didn't flinch. After the event, employees approached her quietly. Some apologized. Others thanked her. One young intern whispered, "Seeing you here, it gives me hope." Isabella smiled gently. "You belong here too." That night, alone on the balcony, Isabella rested her hands over her stomach and breathed in the city air. Justice hadn't come through revenge. It had come through truth. But the final reckoning, the one that would reshape more than just a company, was still ahead. The city responded before the headlines ever did. Word spread, not as gossip but as something heavier. Something reflective. The kind of story people told each other in quieter voices, not with excitement but with recognition. The CEO who stood beside the woman everyone ignored. The assistant who was suspended without drama. The pregnant woman who never demanded, only endured. For the first time in years, Blackwell Industries wasn't being talked about for its profits or acquisitions. It was being talked about for its humanity. Isabella's days changed in subtle ways. She was no longer invisible, but she refused to become ornamental. She spent mornings working remotely, continuing her event coordination projects. Afternoons were for doctor appointments, slow walks, and phone calls with her grandmother, who still reminded her to eat properly and rest. Christopher insisted on being present, for everything. Doctor visits, ultrasounds, late-night cravings that didn't make sense to either of them. He didn't dominate. He didn't control. He listened. One evening, as rain streaked down the penthouse windows, Isabella finally asked the question that had been weighing on her. "What happens next?" she said softly. Christopher leaned back on the couch, thoughtful. That depends on what you want. She looked at him, surprised. I don't want to disappear into your world, she said. And I don't want to be hidden either. You won't be, he said immediately. Not ever. There was no grand promise. No romantic declaration. Just certainty. Across town, Vanessa Sterling sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by silence she wasn't used to. Her phone didn't buzz anymore. Her email didn't fill with requests. Her power, once absolute, had evaporated. She replayed the moment again and again. You weren't special. The words tasted bitter now. She had built her career on hierarchy, on deciding who mattered. And now, for the first time, she was the one being judged, by recruiters who glanced at her resume and asked carefully neutral questions. Why did you leave Blackwell Industries? Vanessa learned something new during those weeks. Humiliation doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. At the company, changes took root. Christopher ordered a full review of front-facing policies. New training programs were introduced. Not performative. Real. Respect wasn't optional anymore. One afternoon, Isabella was invited, hesitantly, to sit in on a leadership meeting. She expected to feel out of place. She didn't. When executives discussed community partnerships, she spoke up, calmly, clearly, offering insights drawn from years of working behind the scenes, organizing events no one remembered but everyone enjoyed. The room listened. Margaret watched quietly, a rare smile tugging at her lips. Afterward, she pulled Isabella aside. You belong in rooms like that, she said. Whether you choose them or not. Isabella exhaled. I never needed power. I just needed respect. Margaret nodded. Sometimes they come together. The public backlash came from unexpected places. A few opinion pieces questioned Isabella's motives. Suggested she had known exactly who Christopher was. Implied calculation. Isabella didn't respond. Christopher did. Not with lawsuits. Not with statements. With transparency. He shared timelines. Facts. Evidence. And then he stopped engaging. The truth didn't need defending. One afternoon, Isabella returned alone to Blackwell Industries. She stood in the lobby, the same marble floors, the same imposing desk. A new receptionist looked up, smiling warmly. Welcome, she said. How can I help you? Isabella smiled back. I'm just here to drop something off. She placed a small envelope on the desk. Inside was a handwritten note addressed to Vanessa Sterling. I hope you learn what it feels like to be seen before being judged. Isabella turned and walked out. Not triumphant. Free. That evening, as she and Christopher sat together watching the city lights, Isabella rested her head against his shoulder. Do you ever think about how different this could have been? She asked. Yes, he admitted. Every day. She placed his hand over her stomach. Then let's make sure it stays different. The first cry came just before sunrise. Soft at first. Then strong. Demanding. Isabella's world narrowed to that single sound, the proof of everything she had endured, everything she had survived. Tears streamed down her face as the nurse placed the baby gently against her chest. A daughter. Christopher stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed in a way no boardroom victory had ever prepared him for. When the nurse guided him closer, his hands trembled as he touched the tiny fingers that curled instinctively around his own. I'm here, he whispered. I promise. Isabella watched him, her heart full in a way words could never capture. Not because of wealth. Not because of status. But because he meant it. The news spread quickly, but this time it felt different. There were no rumors. No cruelty. No doubt. Just a simple truth. A child had been born into a world that had once tried to deny her existence before she even arrived. Margaret arrived first, her usual sharpness softened by tears she didn't bother to hide. She's beautiful, she said, voice thick. You did well, Isabella. Emily burst in next, practically glowing. I knew it'd be a girl, she announced proudly. I just knew. Rose arrived last. Isabella's grandmother moved slowly but steadily, eyes shining as she stood beside the hospital bed. You stood tall, Rose said, touching Isabella's cheek. That's how justice works sometimes. Not loud, not fast, but sure. Isabella nodded, holding her daughter closer. Weeks later, life settled into a new rhythm. Isabella didn't disappear into luxury. She didn't surrender her identity. She built something new. With Christopher's support, but never his shadow, she launched a foundation focused on dignity and access, healthcare, employment, and legal support for women who were ignored, dismissed, or silenced. Not charity. Opportunity. The launch event was held at Blackwell Industries. Isabella stood at the podium, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I was once told I didn't belong in this building," she said calmly. "I was judged before I spoke. Dismissed before I was heard." The room was silent. "But respect doesn't come from titles," she continued. "It comes from how we treat people when we think no one important is watching." Christopher stood in the back, not center stage. Not the focus. Just present. Across the city, Vanessa Sterling watched the live stream from her apartment. No anger rose this time. Only understanding. She closed her laptop quietly. For the first time she saw the truth clearly, not as punishment but as lesson. Years later, Isabella would tell her daughter this story. Not as a tale of revenge, but as proof. That kindness is not weakness. That dignity can survive humiliation. That justice doesn't always shout, but it always arrives. And somewhere in the city, a glass tower still stood tall. But it was no longer remembered for who it kept out. It was remembered for who it finally let in.